Hello and welcome once again to the Fair Game podcast, We Love You Football. I'm Graham Miller, and in this episode, we'll be focusing on the Good Governance Code for Football, what it is, what it means, what needs to be done, and why. I'll introduce our three experts who have all the answers in just a moment. They're raring to go, I can tell you. But first, let's bring ourselves up to date with the latest news about Fair Game from CEO Niall Cooper.
So the world of politics has really been what's taken centre stage for all of us at Fair Game over the last couple of weeks. We saw really recently the new policy paper from the Conservatives on the regulator. Lots of things not quite there, some things there. So we've been lobbying and looking at that. We had some really good productive talks with the civil servants at DCMS as well to kind of raise our concerns. The big thing really still remains about the financial flow in football, but we did get some really good reassurance around things such as the golden share and also things about potentially equality, diversity and inclusion also potentially still being included. A lot of the other elements are in place, and obviously it's really going to be very much all eyes now looking towards the King's Speech in November, which we really hope will finally put on timetable an introduction of an independent regulator into football for the first time, which is obviously going to be massively welcome from all of us here at Fair Game. So obviously that's meant we've been gallivanting up and down the country, going to various fringe events. First up was the Liberal Democrats, and that was a brilliant event hosted by two councillors and notably Lord Tom McNally, who's one of the major spokespeople for the Lib Dems on sport and culture in the Lords. They were really supportive, and we're expecting that they will be running several campaigns through their councillors backing Fair Game and the Fair Game Index. Then it was off to the Conservative Party conference where we were at another fringe event, and we had some really productive talks there with the FSA and the EFL and Kick It Out. So hopefully we've made some good progress there about our shared agendas that we can hopefully push forward on. And we're expecting to also have some presence at the Labour Party conference as well. So that's all going really well. Away from the world of politics, there's also been a couple of other things we've been up to. And primarily that's really the research element. So we're looking at really pushing forward on our various research codes, and you can check that out when going to Fair Game website and looking at projects, and you'll see the 16 projects we're currently working on. They're all happening in different stages. The ones we're really pushing forward at the moment are on things like financial sustainability, but also things like ethics and trying to create a female-friendly football handbook for men's professional football clubs. So all of that looks really exciting and really good, and we're having some great conversations also about getting some funding from a range of universities as we build up our partnerships with various organisations. Some of the really interesting ones of that involve potentially Transparency International and Human Rights Watch, as well as some of the other organisations that we've been working with. So that's all looks really good and really promising. So we're quite looking forward to that. Obviously, on the back of that, one of the obvious ones there is the subject of today's podcast, which is good governance. And that is one of our projects and the first one really to get over the line. And we're absolutely excited with the work that's been put together and led by the major people on the podcast today, who will explain an awful lot more about it. And we'll be putting that whole new good governance code that we developed out for a proper consultation through Fair Game clubs and the wider football environment as we look to really embed a better future for football. And that's always been Fair Game's mantra, that if we see a problem, we're not just here to kind of point fingers, we want to develop those realistic solutions. And the work that's gone into the good governance code that we put together is phenomenal and fantastic, and a huge praise to all the people on the podcast. So that's it. Over to you now, Graham, and hope you all enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Niall, thank you very much indeed. Now, traditionally, and certainly outside the Premier League, the governance of most football clubs tends to be rather simplistic, often likened to running a family business. But in 2023, with rising costs, reduced incomes, and a host of other issues, it's never been more challenging to survive in the current climate. And that's where Fair Game's call for the Good Governance Code comes in. So let's find out all about it. With me on this recording are Radojka Milevic, the independent chair of the Charity Governance Code Steering Group, Mark Middling, assistant professor in accounting at Northumbria University, who has a PhD in accountability in the football industry, and Greg Campbell, an experienced management consultant who specializes in strategy, governance, and business development, among other things. Radojka, let me start with you, if I may. Why is good governance so essential in football, and how could it be a driver for change?
Well, let's start with good governance full stop. It's a way of providing leadership and direction over a long period of time. So the benefit of effective boards is they're not immersed in the day-to-day running of an organisation. Always think of them as standing on top of a hill and looking across to another hill that says, 3, 5 or 10 years. And their responsibility is to, ensure the kind of safe stewardship of resources, but also make sure that change is happening over a period of time. So there are lots of rules and regulations and statutory things around governance, but I think of it, I sort of distill it into something simpler, which is, have you got the right people around the table talking about the right things and working in a way that's open, porous, thoughtful, honest, diligent, collaborative? And as a practitioner, as a governance consultant, in a way, I'm always trying to get close to how do you get clever people around a table to make effective decisions, taking account of the views of stakeholders and to take those decisions over the long term and not for short-term interests. And you can see how that plays into the world of football, the management of the short term and the management of the long term. And in a way, we can see what doesn't work in football. In a way, what we're trying to do is think about the things that are going to engineer the change that helps that long-term financial stewardship and the right relationship between clubs and fans.
You're chair of the Charity Governance Code, the steering group. How does football compare to other industries, would you say?
Well, if we think about some of the smaller clubs, they may have some similarities with smaller charities. There are people who are involved because of their passion for a cause. They are committed to the purpose of their engagement, but they may not have knowledge about the tenets of good governance across sectors. And they are sort of across sectors that there's a homogeneity about what good governance looks like. You'll see the same sorts of things across different codes of governance. So there's an established body of practice there. The challenge for smaller organisations is being in touch with that established body of practice. So I think there are some common challenges for small organisations across different sectors because they won't have the resources to spend money on people giving them lots of governance advice. They will be trying to do their best with the knowledge that they have, which is why codes can be really helpful. They sort of provide a kind of a description of standards and practices and ways of working that allow everyone to understand what does good look like. You can open the code, any code, and there'll be some things about the clarity of roles and responsibilities, about leadership and direction, about financial stewardship, about risk. And that's common across sectors. So in a way, I see common challenges across sectors. I think football, because of the model of ownership, brings some additional complexities that probably Mark and Greg, are well placed to speak about from the work that they've been doing recently.
Well, let me bring Mark in now. What does your research tell us about the way football is being run, and indeed what needs to happen to perhaps, save the game from itself?
Yeah, so my research basically shows that supporters don't believe that clubs are particularly well run, and that there is a need to improve sort of the boardroom operations of clubs, and building on what Rad has just been saying there. When we teach governance and good governance at the university, we tend to talk in principle terms. So if you look at sort of the Corporate Governance Institute or a paper by Henry and Lee in 2014, who created 7 principles of good governance of sport, they're all very common, and this homogeneity that Rad was talking about is absolutely there. So you look at things like responsibility, accountability, independence and awareness, transparency, and you can add to that, depending on whose set of principles you look at, there's anything between 5 and 20. You can add to that, things like competence, the rule of law, ecological sustainability, and so on and so forth. So we always tell students that if management is the art of running a business, then governance is about making sure it's well run. So it's everything that Rad was talking about in terms of having those procedures in place. And football clubs generally do not have that in place. For example, there's only a handful of clubs, including Brentford, that have a non-executive director, that have an independent director. Now, in most organisations, in most large companies and most large organisations, that's just a sort of a de facto way of life. That's exactly how the business operates, and that's where you get the independence from. That kind of the people who are able to sort of come in and sort of see the wood for the trees, and sort of help the executive directors, from a bit of a sort of an arm's length view, and that doesn't really happen in football. You tend to get this kind of concentrated ownership model where one person or a small group of people run the football club. And one participant in my research said, we've got 3 directors with the same surname in 3 stuffed shirts. And what she meant by that is the family ran the business and the other directors effectively nodded along. If you had 3 pillows wearing a shirt, it would have been just as effective. So I think this is the challenge, that you tend to get these kind of people from a very neoliberal capitalist background coming in and buying a football club and wanting to run it in their own way. And football's different. We all know football's different. It's a very special industry. It's fan-led view and everything talks about community assets, and we talk about support has been a very special stakeholder. It's an emotional connection. It's not an economical connection. The transactions here are different to the sort of typical world. So football does need to sort of embrace what's been going on in sort of the wider corporate world for quite some years.
There's something that you're drawing out there about, when you get to the heart of good governance, there's a porosity about the culture of the boardroom. The board moves out of the boardroom to connect with other stakeholders. It understands their views, and the views of stakeholders move into the boardroom. And so that's that fundamental connection between owners, clubs, and fans. And that the 3 individuals are not going to be able, even with the best will in the world, if they had that, they're not going to be able to operate with that kind of porosity. This is something about the diversity of the board, the openness of the culture, and the sort of two-way exchange, which I think the code that's been developed is trying to speak to.
Can I take this a little bit further and think about the link back to communities? Because I think that's absolutely fundamental when we look at these issues in a football context. Many, many years ago, I recall that there were sociological studies done in particular towns looking at correlation, whether there was correlation between the fortunes of the local football club and how they got on on a Saturday in relation to output at local industries. And it was striking that when the club did well, output at in various mills or whatever it was, factories, went up, and when the club performed poorly, it went down again. Over the last 40 years, I was looking at a list earlier, over the last 40 years, 69 clubs have gone into administration, a number of them more than once. Most of those clubs have survived, fortunately. Some haven't. Think about Bury or Macclesfield or various others. What happens to those communities when a club doesn't survive? And of course, the reasons that those clubs have got into major problems, administration and possibly dissolution or whatever, it's not because they weren't very good on the pitch. It's because of off the pitch issues, decisions at board level, bad business decisions, financial mismanagement, in some cases fraud. But of course, who suffers from that? It's the fans. And, another example, I mean, they might not have gone into administration, but you think about what happened to Wimbledon, obviously very close to Niall's heart, when the owner just said, well, sod this for a game of soldiers. We're moving 50 miles away and we're going to change the name of the club. Where does that leave the fans? We're all fans of Ted Lasso. Well, look, okay, I'm a huge fan of Ted Lasso. And one of my favorite bits is, I think it was from season 3. I don't know. I mean, I've watched all the episodes more than once. Is where Ted says, we need to let the fans into the stadium so they can watch the training. And one of the other coaches says, are you sure, Ted? Is that a good idea? And he comes up with this wonderful statement with, it's their club. It's the fans' club, really. We're just minding it for a while, and then we'll move on and we'll hand it back to them. But too often, that is, even though it's a reality, it's missing from the way that football is run. It's not like saying, oh, the local Tesco's closing down or relocating, I'm going to go to Sainsbury's or Lidl instead. As a supporter, it's generally your club for life. And that's why football is different from normal business activities. And it shouldn't be left to self-regulate because, hey, my experience in different sectors is self-regulation does not work.
So is it money and greed that's the root of the problem then, when those people in power suddenly get some money and all their good ideals go out the window?
I don't think it's that. I think it's the matter of getting carried away. I don't think too many owners go into it intending to be bad owners. I think some do, but I think the majority don't. And I think it's getting caught up in the rat race of needing to spend more money in order to succeed on the pitch. And this is, this plays out when you look at sort of wage to revenue ratios. In the championship, for example, the average wage to revenue, depending on which year you look at it, it's sort of 106, 120%. It's absolutely ridiculous. It wasn't until a recent TV deal that collectively the Premier League made losses every single year. So there's an awful lot of money flowing into the game, but unfortunately, it's the Alan Sugar prune juice analogy. If they're all going out and playing wages, it's unless you're Manchester United with a massive worldwide presence and brand that you can utilize, you don't make money in football. And arguably, that's not what it's about. Look at Abramovich when he was at Chelsea, for example, and it wasn't about making money. It was about other successes. The returns weren't measured in pounds; they were measured in trophies.
But there is something there, isn't there, about the need for solvency?
Oh, absolutely.
And then sort of longer term financial sustainability. And the model at the moment, I mean, it's very hard, as football works at the moment, for clubs to kind of, remain sort of financially sustainable over the longer term. And when I look at it from a sort of helicopter view, it feels like the inequalities in football are so stark now between the fan base, where the players are, how the club is run, to be kind of, within a kind of model that doesn't really work very well. It's very difficult. I would think very carefully about becoming an owner of a football club.
The old joke, of course, was always how do you make a small fortune from owning a football club? Start with a big fortune. And I think there's still a lot of truth in that, particularly as you move away from the Premiership. Except what's been going on in the Premiership, and following on from Mark's point about TV revenues and all that kind of thing. And the way that the game is being marketed internationally, and we saw some of this with the fiasco of the European Super League couple of years ago. Some big clubs right at the top of the game, so it's seen as an opportunity to actually make a lot of money, and some of the characters who are looking to come into ownership, and possibly in some cases may even have come into ownership, have got quite different motivations from those who are looking to work with and support a club in the National League or Leagues 1 and 2.
So we need the code. That's clear from all the things you've been saying. Where are we, in fact? When will this code see the light of day, do you think? Where are we realistically?
Well, the Tracy Crouch review, which was published in late 21, and the government's white paper, which was published in February of this year, recognise the need for an independent regulator for football, and as part of their responsibilities, there is an expectation that there will be a code of good governance that clubs will be expected to abide by. So once legislation is in place, and we're waiting at the moment to see if it's going to be in the Queen's speech to introduce legislation for independent regulation, and once that comes into effect, the regulator's established, we'd expect the regulator to issue a code of good governance. I mean, no doubt there's going to be a lot of consultation along the way. As part of the preparation for that, Fair Game has recognised that there's a value in our developing a draft code which can be consulted on with clubs and presented to the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and that's what a number of us have been working on over recent months.
It's a very Blue Peter style. Here's one we prepared earlier. So when IREF is put in place, you know, there's at least a start for 10 there that they can work from. You know, we've been working with some excellent partners on this. You know, there's been a very high caliber of people from both the sporting and the governance world involved in this, and we're immensely proud of the output.
And we have to be optimistic about the power of codes, because we've seen codes in other sectors provide a sort of uplift. You know, they're not a guarantee against poor governance. You know, poor governance will happen in all sectors for different reasons. But I think if you look at the Code for Sports Governance and its impact on national governing bodies, the diversity of those organisations, the transparency of those organisations, then, you know, recent changes, they're moving towards, you know, equality, diversity and inclusion action plans. You know, it's been quite profound, the shift. In the housing sector, the shift around enormous boards, you know, with, you know, I remember working with a board where someone had been on the board for 40 years. You know, that doesn't help with good governance and the refresh of ideas and people who have experienced other organisations. So the housing, various iterations of the housing code have progressively changed the social housing sector. In the charitable sector, it's complicated. There are thousands of charities and many of them are very small. So it's slow work, but there is a kind of accepted framework now of how that sector sort of looks at tenets of good governance. So we see the impact of codes across sectors, obviously in the corporate sector as well. So, you know, I feel really optimistic about the code. I think it could have a really positive impact on boards in football.
Rad was optimistic, Greg, for the future, but from what we've just heard, those clubs in serious debt, the code isn't going to help them. I mean, the fans of these clubs, what must they be thinking? Is it gloom and doom? There's no way out.
I think it really depends on the starting point when regulation comes into being. I mean, there are a number of different aspects to regulation, and part of the whole sort of panoply of changes that need to be made would relate to the financial flow, and moving away from the current situation where just clubs in the Premiership get more than the lion's share of all of the money that is that comes into the game. So there's fair distribution down through the different levels of the pyramid. There are, but from the point of view of fans, the sort of code that we've developed is going to require that fans have an important seat at the table. I mean, you know, potentially one might be talking about having supporters sitting on the board. But even if supporters are not sitting on the board of a football club, there is an expectation, and indeed there would be a requirement, that fans are consulted on all major issues, and that there should be a kind of a sort of golden share or a golden veto, change of name of the club, change of location, something like that. But also that there should be openness and constructive consultation by the board around all major decisions relating to the club. I don't mean the sort of once in 5 years, once in 10 years type decisions, on a continuing basis. So we would expect, and this is set out in our draft code, that there would be an annual report for supporters, which goes into a reasonable degree of detail about how the club has been operating, what decisions it's been making. We would expect the club to have a proper business and financial plan, budgets and management accounts, and to be consulting on material aspects with a sort of supporters committee or shadow board. Obviously, there will be areas where it's a little bit delicate, commercial confidentiality, and what every club is in competition with every other one. So there would be limits on how much information could go out, but and one would need to look at the basis for the sharing. Nonetheless, there is an awful lot that there can be engagement with fans and fan representatives around.
The plan is a good one, clearly, but does it all rest on, for want of a better word, the generosity of the Premier League clubs who hold all the money, and that's the cash that the rest of the pyramid needs?
I think that's a very good point, and I think obviously the Premier League and the EFL are in negotiation at the moment, and depending on who you listen to, it seems to be at a fairly advanced level now. And one thing that personally I was disappointed about in the white paper and the recent consultation document that's come out as well is the sort of insistence that the football needs to find a solution to distribution. There is greed in the Premier League. We've seen that as was alluded to earlier with the European Super League. The clubs want, they're acting in very self-interested ways. And I think if you give the Premier League a chance, they would, try and keep as much money as they possibly can in order to give, themselves the best, possible chance of success. And at Fair Game, we advocate that more money should flow down the leagues, and it should be done on the basis of things like good governance at clubs, how well they're managed financially, how good the sort of EDI policies are, and how good the fan engagement is. They're the four aspects of our fan engagement. Of our Fair Game Index that came out earlier this year. And you do see some good clubs. Exeter, for example, I know they're fan owned, but just because they're fan owned doesn't. We don't have to set them aside from anybody else because of that. They're still a very well-run club. Plymouth Argyle as well. Their main competitors are a well-run club also. I've mentioned Brentford already, Lincoln City. There are good clubs out there. It's just a matter of helping these clubs out by rewarding them for good behaviour. At the moment, we incentivize bad behaviour. We incentivize overspending. How do you get more money as a football club from the Premier League? You need to go up a division. How do you go up a division? You spend more money than you can afford on players in order to get out of the division. It's bonkers, and it's the root cause of the problem. And it's one of the things that is kind of holding back good governance in football. Is this, as I said earlier, the rat race, the arms race, to try and achieve greater glory and chasing more success and the money that comes with that. Not every club is going to be able to get to the Premier League. People talk about Accrington Stanley, another very well-run club. Again, it all hinges on one person. It's the attitude of Andy Holt that means that club's very well run. But Accrington fans, I've spoken to some Accrington fans, and competing in League One was quite an achievement for them. Particularly on the budget that club has got. If you go to the Wham Stadium and you look at Accrington, you think it's really quite a small club. But it was competing for a few years in League One. Okay, they had an unlucky year last year, but they haven't sort of gone against their principles of stability, and they haven't a good start of it in League Two to go back up.
Yeah, is this then where the football regulator comes in? She has got to bang heads together to make the Premier League come to the table. But I don't know how much power the regulator will have. It almost seems an impossible position, even if we do have a regulator. Is that fair?
I think if the regulator has got powers to license clubs to participate in particular competitions, and also to determine which competitions are appropriate, then yeah, the regulator would have quite a lot of power. That's what's proposed, and if it's carried through effectively, that would prevent a European Super League happening again. At least, certainly on the sort of basis that was proposed nearly 2.5 years ago now.
The overriding feeling from the participants that I've spoken to for the research that I've done is that, football will sort this out itself. This isn't sell. It's not something that the majority of clubs are going to buy into. There are some good clubs. We've got 34 of them signed up for Fair Game, for example. But this is going to have to be a towel. This is going to have to be, a regulator stepping in and telling football clubs this is how it's got to be done. Because I think football's had its chance, and it's basically failed.
The trouble is, though, Rad, whether you're a football fan or not, it's quite clear if somebody brings money to your club, all these very nice idealistic thoughts and plans and words are going to go out the window. Hey, we're getting a load of money. We can compete with the big boys again. It comes back to this money situation, doesn't it? And I think you can be optimistic as much as you like, but clubs will change their attitude on this success that Mark has highlighted. It's a vicious circle.
But that's why you need the regulator, isn't it? In a way, you need some framework that coerces the swim lane to operate in a certain way. Otherwise, someone's going all across the kind of swimming pool, she said in a rather ill-fitting metaphor. I mean, we all know as football fans, the ambivalent feeling of feeling passionate about a club and then deeply uncomfortable about the model of ownership or the stewardship at a senior level, and the deep discomfort that creates for fans. I'm a passionate football fan, and I know other fans who have sometimes stopped going to games because of the model of ownership that's suddenly, taken over at their club and how they feel it affects the decision making. And that's a really horrible feeling, isn't it? That sense of I sort of love you in spite of your model, and I always feel that sense of gloom a little bit for clubs that get promoted, where the manager is the best thing in the world, and then the next season is going to be a struggle about whether they keep their job or not, because how can they compete with the resources of the clubs that say at the top of the Premiership? And I always think, it's such a poison chalice, everyone wants to be promoted, but it's look what comes the other side of that. So that can't be right, can it, from a longitudinal perspective? And I think there is a longitudinal perspective on this as well. So some things, might happen quickly, but the process of kind of changing boards, I mean, when I say longitudinal, I don't mean sort of 20 years. I think the Code for Sports Governance come in 2016, maybe. So 7 years later, we're seeing, much more diverse boards, more women on boards, for example. They have produced change. So change is possible, but maybe we need to look at things over a slightly longer period of time. And then in the meantime, look at the kind of the guidelines, the parameters, the framework that a regulator can impose on what effective decision making might look like.
Not all clubs have sort of reneged on their principles. Luton are one. They're one of our fair game clubs, and they're sticking to their principles even though they got to the Premier League. Norwich as well. Okay, yo-yo club, but they're sticking to their principles of not overextending the budget. Rotherham are another one a little bit further down who struggle to compete in the Championship, and they tend to yo-yo between the Championship and League One. But there's absolutely no chance that those clubs are going to go out of business because they're well-run clubs. They're not being sucked into the gamble, and a lot of it is about the communication and the messaging that you give to fans. Again, I come back to Accrington. When I spoke to the head of the Supporters Trust there, he was like, fans are bought into the journey. They understand the resources that the club is competing with in comparison to everybody else, and communication and transparency like that's what part of good governance is. And that's how we get everyone buying into the philosophy, if you like, and the journey that the club is on.
In terms of good governance, you mentioned Luton in the Premier League. The difference there at Kenilworth Road is there's not a single betting commercial anywhere, which is quite remarkable.
Isn't that great? It's not a club just going after the most amount of money that they can obtain. And I think it was on the Price of Football podcast a few days ago where they were saying, they possibly lost out on 2, 3, 4 million pounds of revenue over the past few years by not having a betting sponsorship. But I think Luton are, if they can get to the Premier League without having betting sponsorships on the budget that they've got, it just goes to show that, compare them to Everton, for example, who have spent, was it 750 million pounds or something? It's not what you spend, it's how you spend it. It's, there is a sporting element to this too.
Greg, we're coming to the end of our time. Can you sum up for us? I mean, we're optimistic, we're a bit pessimistic, we're realistic. Where are we really at this moment to finish it off? Should we look forward with some hope?
I think we should look forward with some hope. I mean, a key aspect is of course whether legislation is going to come forward. As I mentioned earlier, is it going to be in the King's Speech in November? I think if it is, and if the legislation is drawn in line with what was in the recommendations of the Tracy Crouch review and much of what was in the white paper issued earlier this year, there is a very good chance that it will go through. There is significant support, not just within the government and on the Conservative benches, but certainly also from Labour, front bench. Labour spokespeople have been prominent in supporting the sort of principles that Fair Game has been putting forward, and likewise from the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Nationals. So if legislation is introduced, I would expect it to go through. Might be affected, of course, depending by what happens with the date of the general election. But even if it doesn't happen by the time of the general election, I believe it would be a priority for a new government of whatever colour. So beyond that, I mean, how long does it take to pass the legislation? Perhaps 9 months. Then you're looking at about a year at a guess to set up an independent regulator. We could potentially be looking at regulation being in place 2025, as soon as that, I would think. But of course, one shouldn't underestimate the amount of work that's required to set up a new regulator from scratch.
Well, let's end on that positive note. We can look forward to what's going to happen in 2025. Excellent. Listen, Rad, Greg and Mark, thank you so much for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation. If you've enjoyed it, do please subscribe to the Fair Game podcast. You can find it on all the usual channels, and we're even on TikTok. I'm Graham Miller. The producer is Ian Beach. Thank you for listening. And until the next edition of We Love You Football, it's goodbye for now.